For most of us, the way that it works is that we have to make a lot of mistakes and then work our way forward from those mistakes. That's how it works for 99% of us. And if you don't accept that making those mistakes is the only way we learn, then every time we fail, you're going to beat yourself up.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For 50 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Derek Fassbender.
Welcome, listeners. I'm Derek Fassbender, host of the B&H Photography Podcast.
And I'm Jill Waterman, the podcast's senior creative producer.
I'm Mike Weinstein, the show's technical producer and audio engineer.
How often do you think beyond the photos you make to consider the larger purpose they serve, both for yourself and ideally for a wider audience? We're going to explore this idea in today's show, connecting the dots between picture making, process, and purpose in a chat with nature and landscape photographer and mountaineer Matt Payne and street photographer, portraitist, and YouTube storyteller Sean Tucker. While Matt and Sean may have widely differing photographic specialties, they share much in common, from educational backgrounds and a continuing interest in psychology to a profound commitment in using photography to find purpose in life. We're going to introduce you in a second, but before we dive in, here's some additional background about them both. Matt Payne is a nature and landscape photographer based in Durango, Colorado. After connecting with nature first as a climber and mountaineer, his relationship shifted to photography. Nature has an innate beauty that doesn't need to be exaggerated, so he strives to capture landscapes in ways that are truthful and ethical. In 2017, Matt launched the podcast Stop, Collaborate, and Listen as a way to dive into meaningful conversations with other photographers and industry leaders about photography, ethics, and the challenges of rapid environmental change. He is also co-founder of Nature First Photography, an organization to help increase ethical awareness in nature photography, and the Natural Landscape Photography Awards to celebrate nature photographers who dedicate themselves to photographing and editing their work in a realistic fashion. Having already summited all 100 of Colorado's centennial peaks, in 2023, Matt completed a 567-mile hike across the Colorado Trail for his current project, The Colorado Way, a book of mountains, trails, and growth. Featuring over 140 images and 25 essays, this book blends photography, storytelling, psychology, and wilderness to reflect on what it means to live with intention, resilience, and awe. Sean Tucker is a photographer, filmmaker, author, speaker, and storyteller. Born in the UK, Sean spent most of his formative years in Africa, where he served as a youth pastor in South Africa during his 20s. Although that role is now behind him, Sean still carries a fascination with psychology and spirituality, which he brings to discussions around creativity. As a photographer and filmmaker, he's been fortunate to tell visual stories for individuals, NGOs, and multinational corporations across more than 20 countries. He's also helped organizations set up in-house studios and train them to tell their own compelling visual stories. More recently, Sean built a large following online, both on YouTube and Instagram, where he talks about the why behind the things we make, seeking to inspire people on their own creative journeys. In 2021, Sean published the book The Meaning in the Making to further share his philosophy for living a creative life. Matt Payne and Sean Tucker, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much.
No, thank you guys for joining. Matt, I got to go 567 miles. 10 miles is a lot for me. I kind of want to take us off the beaten path, pun intended, to talk about that trek. I mean, that's some kind of resilience. What does it take mentally to keep yourself locked in for that?
Well, it's a pretty beautiful thing that happens to you when you give yourself space away from the daily distractions of social media and all of the responsibilities that we have on the day-to-day basis. And honestly, I was really driven by that intellectual freedom of just exploring my place in the world. And really, that gave me all the resilience that I needed to keep going on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, there's a lot of physical preparation that you have to do to accomplish something like that. But the mental side of it, I personally didn't think was the hardest part. But that's probably going to be different for every single person.
Yeah, definitely. And according to your bio, you were a hiker, mountaineer before you touched a camera. So I want to know from a photography perspective, was that something that as you're out exploring these natural landscapes, I know it's inherent for a lot of people to see the beauty and be like, wow, I'd love to capture this. And that's what gets a lot of people into photography. Is that how it was for you, or what was it that brought photography to your life?
When I first got into photography, I was really just using it as a means to document my journey of climbing the highest 100 mountains in Colorado. And so I was really just bringing the camera along to just take pictures for posterity purposes. My dad had climbed a lot of the same mountains that I was trying to climb. And every time I was asking him questions about certain routes or different mountains that I was going to do, he was like, yeah, I think there's like a challenging part here, or you got to think about this. But he didn't have any photographs to go along with it. And I thought that was something that I could improve upon in order to be able to pass that information and knowledge down to my family members or friends that might be following along on the journey. So that's how it started.
Interesting. And Sean, it's kind of a similar thing with you. You studied psychology, theology, but photography wasn't first for you either. So how did photography come to you?
I think I was always like creatively inclined. Like I really enjoyed making things right from being a kid. But I had a little point and shoot film camera when I was probably, I don't know, about 8 or 9 years old. My dad had left a few years before, so I was kind of this little, quite underconfident little boy. And this little camera was kind of like a prop that, you know, people around would leave me alone. They wouldn't ask what I was doing if I had this little camera in my hand. And it was a way for me to just kind of engage with the world and find some confidence. And it was this, you remember those little, you know, sort of had the click and zip, zip when you wind it on? It was one of those little guys. And I'd taken a couple of photographs as a kid that I remember getting compliments for, that I remember getting, oh, that's good. My mom even, we'd been down to the seaside and I'd kind of crept forward to take a photograph of a seagull standing on the railings. And when I'd snapped this photograph and 2 weeks later, she had developed them and had them all over the kitchen table. She picked up that photograph and she said, oh, that's good. Maybe you'll be a photographer one day. And I think it was just like this feeling of maybe I can do a thing, you know, maybe I have something to contribute. And so that kind of stuck in my head. And then I think I abandoned it all for a while. I would say all through my 20s, I didn't really touch a camera much until it came back around with video when I was working for the church, trying to make a bit of money on the side of church work, because I don't know if you know, but the church doesn't pay super well. So I needed to kind of offset the income a little bit. And video was my way back in. And then I sort of picked up a camera. And then by the time I'd done working for the church, I just turned 30. It was a friend of mine who said to me, you know, if you have to start again, and you sunk 10 years into a career you don't want to do anymore, you might as well pick something you love and see if you can make it your career. So I thought, I wonder if I can make photography work.
And here we are.
Yeah.
Apparently, it worked out pretty good for you. Now, I'd be remiss not to mention that it's 2 years to the day since you guys were on a podcast episode together. So it's kind of a nice little anniversary here. We get you back on the exact date that you guys recorded a couple of years ago, and a lot of great topics there. But something that I think ties you guys together is that sense of purpose. And that's something that you guys are both into the philosophical and psychological approach, or rather, you see the deeper meaning behind photography. Now, everyone out there listening, they know where I'm going with this. They're like, oh no, he's going back out into the woods again. But I think that's something that all three of us can connect on. Sean, Jung's concept about the two creative halves. Everybody has these two parts of creativity. Can you talk about this concept a little bit and how it applies in practical terms and what it means to you?
Yeah, I mean, Jung had this idea. Jung was obviously a psychoanalyst more than a century ago, but he had this idea that life was split into two halves, broadly speaking, that you had a morning and an afternoon of life. And he basically said that in that morning of life, you build the things that are important to you. You try and define who you are. You build a sense of self. So you do things like you decide what sort of job you want and what sort of partner you want in life and what sort of house you want to live in and what your politics are and what you believe about life, the universe and everything. And you do science, which part of that do you accept? Where are you more esoteric? All this kind of stuff. You kind of build a sense of self. And then he suggests that at that midpoint in your journey, and it's not like a literal midpoint, you can't date it. It comes earlier for some and later for others, but you hit a midpoint where there's some kind of crisis in your life. So somebody close to you dies, or you lose a partner, or you're fired from your job that you've sunk all these years into. And then you go back to that kind of box of characteristics about yourself that you constructed in the first half. And you'll probably find that the answers aren't in there. You didn't build enough in there to answer this current crisis. And so you have a choice then. Either you can jump back into the box and just reinforce it because this is what you built and you can't think about starting again, which unfortunately just leads to usually bitter older people in life who sort of push the world away because they can't face the incongruencies in their own psyche. Or you can move through to what he calls the afternoon of life, or the second half of life, where you don't need to define things as tightly. You can hold paradox more comfortably and hold things looser. And then you search for things that are more meaningful rather than just like the shop window dressing you put on the outside of yourself. You're trying to build something deeper and more meaningful. He's the guy who coined the phrase, the midlife crisis, which obviously we're familiar with. And that's that kind of high noon point. So in terms of your creativity, I mean, there's obvious parallels. You know, when we start, say photographers, right? We start in photography and we do the building stuff. We build the box, right? We construct what sort of photography we want to be. So we do things like watch 1,000 YouTube tutorials to get tips and tricks for what we can do that make our photography better. We spend lots of money on camera gear thinking that that camera is going to make us a good photographer. And I'm the guy who shoots with this particular camera. That's part of my makeup. And it takes us a little while to realize you could still take terrible photos with great cameras. But we spend the money and we do it. And then we've got all this stuff now. We work out, you know, what genre do we want to be in? What sort of colors do we want to use in our images? Are we a black and white photographer? Do we like shallow depth of field, deep depth of field? We do all this stuff, you know, we construct a photographer with a look and a style that's all ours and hopefully recognizable. But there will come a crisis point. And so many photographers will relate to this. They'll get to that point and they'll go, yeah, but I just don't feel like my work has any meaning, you know, or why am I doing this? Or what does it mean? You know, we built all this stuff, but what does it actually mean? And that's that high noon point in creativity. You've built all the outside stuff. You've got all the techniques, but it feels like there's no core to it. We're not saying much with it. And that's that point where we can either go back and just buy another camera or learn a new technique, or we can go, that's not the answer. I have to move into that second half of my journey and dig a bit deeper and work out how can I point this thing at something that means something and create work that actually says something I care about.
Mm. And when in your process, Sean, like when did that really take hold? I mean, we were talking a little bit before we started recording today about, you know, the experience, and a lot of what we learn, you can't really learn at an earlier part in your career because you haven't had the experience behind it. You focus on different things. When for you did you really start to sit back and ponder these deeper thoughts as it relates to your work?
It kind of comes in waves, and it comes in different sort of things that I do, but I'll give you a big one. So one is that it would have been about 2015, I think. So I'd left the church in 2009. And this was like me daring to try and make photography my job, you know, the thing that paid the bills. For a good 3 years after that, even though I'd made lots of videos and taken lots of images, I waited tables as my main source of income. And that was from 30, 31, 32, 33 years old, because I just didn't know how to do the business side. And my images were okay, but they weren't good enough yet, if I'm honest. And then I slowly started to get jobs with companies. At the beginning, it was food photography and moved into product photography, started in South Africa, moved over to the UK. And it was Christmas 2015. And I remember that because the office was completely empty. I was now the head of photography for a big company in London that sold furniture and all this sort of stuff. And I led the photography department there. And I remember sitting, looking out the window at Christmas shoppers down on the street, thinking that if I could go back to myself when I'd left the church and tell myself, hey, you made it. You got exactly what you wanted. You're the head of photography department. It's only taken you 6 or 7 years. But I just looked out the window and thought, like, what I'm doing doesn't matter. It's not that I wasn't grateful for the fact that I got to pay the bills with a camera. That's always a privilege and nothing to be taken for granted. But I knew then that, like, I needed more for my artistic output than just helping rich people buy sofas. You know, it wasn't meaningful enough to me. And I had this crisis point where it's like I could just go back in and ride out the fact that I have this title and that's enough. I don't need anything more for it. Or I can get honest and say But I probably need to start undoing some of this and moving away from it, because making meaningful work is more important than titles and making money. And it was just this really stark moment for me.
Interesting. Now, Matt, this parallels your approach where, you talk about really we're addicted to dopamine and we want these hits. And there's a lot of focus on, I think, things that don't really serve us on a deeper level. It's kind of like a scratching the surface and a quick hit. But, I know you believe in challenging yourself and becoming comfortable with discomfort. And these are the things that kind of build us up and kind of playing off what you were just talking about, Sean, about living with purpose and having intent. Matt, can you talk a little bit about this idea of introducing discomfort into your life and being not so focused on the dopamine hits, but on things of a deeper nature?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's been a lot of psychological research about this concept and the impacts that dopamine addiction are having on our day-to-day lives. I mean, if you think about our modern lives today, we have instantaneous access to all sorts of things that can increase our dopamine very quickly. We have ice cream at a moment's notice. We have Netflix television shows that we can binge watch over and over again. And we get into this kind of treadmill mode where it creates this effect that when you have all that dopamine constantly hitting you like that, the brain has a natural tendency to push the lever back down to create balance. And what that usually manifests as is anxiety and depression. And that's why we're seeing a lot more of that in our modern society. And one of the greatest ways to push against that and reset that balance is this concept of hormesis, where you purposely seek out things that are a little bit discomforting. The most obvious one for me is physical activity, or challenging yourself to reach the top of a mountain, or going for a jog or a run, things of that nature that might not be easy for you to accomplish. And when you do that on a consistent basis, it helps to reset those dopamine levels in your brain. And when you actually do get natural forms of dopamine, they have more natural purpose behind them. And I found that to be super true on my Colorado Trail journey, because there were days where I was doing 26, 27, 28 miles a day, gaining 4,000 feet of elevation, climbing 2 or 3 mountains along the way. And at the end of the day, I was riding a massive high, but it was sustained. It wasn't like, oh, I got to go eat some more ice cream now to keep this going. And so that definitely speaks true to my personal experience. And there's a ton of psychological research that backs it up as well.
Yeah, it's like a good, clean high that you get from working out, endurance, even creating something. And I think there's those people that want to work and they see the beauty in the journey and in the imperfection. And they don't look at getting knocked down as a bad thing. They look at getting up as a good thing. And I think that's the difference in the mindset. And when I look at what you guys put out into the world, it's that mindset. It's really dusting yourself off and not focusing on the tripping and falling, but on the conquering the trip and the fall. During you guys' conversation 2 years ago, Matt, you had just quit your day job, which, as we all know, is not an easy thing to do, especially in this time, in this climate. But looking back, you have 2 years under your belt now. And I know a lot of our listeners out there have probably been in the same position where we always hear, take that leap. And you have a stable job. Do you take the leap and do something that potentially could be a big risk? 2 years under your belt now, Matt. Where are we at?
Yeah, I love this. So if I'm going to be completely honest with you, I just want to mention one thing, that the timing of my conversation with Sean was incredibly instrumental in the changes I was making in my life. As you mentioned, I quit my day job and I've been working in the nonprofit sector for over 20 years. And I had made this kind of pivotal decision to go into photography full time. And I was literally having exactly what Sean was describing, a kind of a midlife crisis, although I was kind of entering it more from a perspective of a midlife celebration. And the timing of our conversation was so perfect because I took everything that Sean said in our podcast together to heart. And I used my adventure on the Colorado Trail to reflect on that first half of my journey as a human being and as a photographer, and then pondered, like, what does that mean for me as a photographer? What does that mean for me as a person? How can I use this experience hiking the Colorado Trail to find more purpose, more meaning in what I'm doing as a photographer? And so that's been a large part of my focus since then is I intentionally entered the trail by forcing myself to think about a different psychological or philosophical concept every single day on the trail. And I took lots of notes along the way as you're hiking. And every night I recorded a video journal. And I went in with that intention largely because of some of the things that Sean instilled into my brain when we chatted. So I have lots of gratitude to Sean Tucker for that. Things in my life right now are going really well. I'm teaching full time for Munch workshops. Honestly, I was a little bit afraid of losing some of my purpose in life with the transition because I was in the helping profession my whole career. And now I was transitioning into leading photography workshops. And I was worried that I was going to lose connection with that side of my persona of wanting to have meaningful differences in the lives of others. And I found that I've been able to do that through photography education because, as you probably all know, photography can be so much more than just teaching people about aperture and shutter speed and composition. It can also be about connecting with subjects, finding your love for various types of things, really leaning heavily into your curiosity about the natural world and exploring the why behind what we're capturing. And I think that has been really exciting for me to be able to do that on our photography workshops.
You bring up an interesting thing there, Matt, that I want to throw over to you, Sean. Matt, you talk about having these 20 years of helping people, and then all of a sudden you're in a different position. Now, Sean, you've had your own transitions from being a preacher, a product photographer, a videographer, and then you get into this world where you have a huge audience. You have a YouTube and an Instagram that people gravitate to. How did you handle that happening? Was that something that just kind of happened out of the clear blue? Was that something that you had planned and plotted for? And then you get to this point where now, wow, everything I say people listen to. When you're out there pumping purpose into the universe, not everybody has that same, they can't grasp that. So are you worried about what do the people want? What do they expect from me? How do you handle that transition from not just career shifts, but from going as an artist and a creative who is creating solely for yourself to now being on a huge platform?
My family's joke about it is the only reason I started a YouTube channel was so I could keep preaching, which is not untrue. I mean, I think it kind of comes down to, knowing how you're wired and a bit of self-knowledge and understanding. Like, it doesn't matter if you took away photography or YouTube channels from me. If you took it all away today, I'd find another way to do it. I know what my drive is underneath it all. Like everything that's been on the top. And this goes back to, studying psychology at university, working for the church for a decade. Before that, I wanted to rehabilitate big cats back into the wild. I was always like trying to work out how do I help? And then obviously, coming out of the church and then I worked for myself as a photographer for 4 or 5 years, but then I quickly thought, like, how do I get back some of the stuff that really gave me the juice when I worked for the church? And I think it was always to do with how do I talk to people in a way that just dials down some of that anxiety they feel about life. I use a quote in the book I wrote. It's from an American pastor, actually, and the language is slightly religious, but you'll get the point. There's a guy named Frederick Buechner. He said that the place God calls you to is the place where your deep joy and the world's deep hunger meet. So it's this idea that you take the thing that gives you joy. So for me, that's photography and filmmaking and writing and all those things. And that's half of the equation. If I want to find meaning out of that, I have to point it at somewhere that I think the world is hungry. And for me, that's clear. It's always been, I've had family members and I've had partners in my life who've really battled with mental health and specifically anxiety. So I can see the pattern throughout my life. Whatever I've chosen to do next, I've found a way to turn it into, how can I point this thing that I love at people's felt anxiety and dial down the volume a bit? And if I manage to do that, that feels like meaningful work for me. And like I say, if you take it all the way today, I'll just find a different way to do it, because that's how I'm wired. And I think what I'm supposed to be spending my energy doing. So, it all kind of comes from understanding what drives you. And it's different for all of us. You have to look into yourself and go, like, what are the two halves of that equation? The one is what really brings you joy, not what does everyone else say you're good at, what gives you a bit of an ego boost, what really gives you joy, what when you're doing it makes you lose track of time. What if you've done it for hours and hours, even though you're a bit tired, you're more energized somehow. That's your deep joy. And then looking around and going, what do I see in the world that really needs change? What do I see in the world? Something that's a bit broken that needs to be fixed a bit. Is there a way I can point the thing I love at that? I think that's that sweet spot for meaning, for me anyway. I think that's why I find myself where I am. And, I honestly, even though what I'm doing is getting harder and harder to sustain in the practicalities, financially and all the rest of it, it's much harder doing YouTube now and all the rest of it. But I'll get long emails from people who just sort of share their life stories about, where they've been struggling. And then they'll say, something you said in this video just helped me carry on for a little bit longer. That'll keep me motivated for a year. Emails like that, where I couldn't care about the numbers. That's deeply motivating for me in terms of what I do. And I love it because of that.
I love how both of you guys have like this way of, it's like weaving together where you'll say one thing, Sean, and I can kind of relate it to something that I heard Matt say earlier. Or Matt, you'll say something and it's something that I've seen ever present in Sean's work. So it's like, I see how there's like a natural gel between you guys, just beyond even the philosophy and the psychology. You guys really are living the lives that you want to live. And Sean, you just hit the nail on the head right there with, it's really just comes down to being yourself. Like you sound so sure of who you are and your purpose in life and what you want to do, and constantly being a student, never realizing that you're beyond learning something, which I think is something that is so beautiful about the entire creative process, and using that to constantly progress. Now, Matt, I want to go back to this hike again. I'm an endurance athlete. So for me, I'm just sitting here. I keep seeing the number 567 miles and it just blows my mind. I want to pair that in with the creative aspect. Knowing how grueling it is, take us onto that journey. How are you pairing photography and creativity and balancing that with just trying to complete this task? Like, can you talk us through like what a typical day looked like? How much was shooting? How much was hiking?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there definitely were days where you only took like 3 photographs, and there were days where you took 300 photographs. And it really depended on a lot of different variables, depending on where I was along the journey, how I was feeling mentally and physically, or really whether or not I was inspired by what I was seeing. But with that journey, I kind of went into it with the mindset of having pretty much no creative expectations in terms of what I would be inspired by or what I would create. And I went into it with a super open mind in terms of responding to what I discovered along the way. And I purposely gave myself some days in my plan of the hike where I put myself in places where I knew it would have a lot more photographic potential. And I gave myself extra time in those places and carved out different side tracks. And side note, like I climbed like 30 mountains along the way on the trail. And that was intentional because I wanted to further challenge myself, but also like I knew that those had a lot of photographic potential as well. And there were so many moments where I was surprised by what I discovered. Like I was photographing this mountain scene at 13,500 feet, and this fox came running up to me, and I had to quickly pivot to try to get the fox in the photograph. And that was just such a beautiful moment for me. I had a family of moose come into my campsite, and the bull moose and the baby moose were playing together in this field with this amazing sunset overhead. And all of those unexpected surprises is what kept me motivated, and it kept the creative juices flowing. And I think the key to that is just having an open mind and being super curious about what you might discover, and being honest with where you're at in terms of your mental state, and letting that kind of drive the process as you go along the journey.
Matt, I'm curious, how long did this trek take you? And did you pre-plan that, or how close were you? Did it match your expectation of how long it would take?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I pretty much had the entire trip sketched out on a spreadsheet. The main reason for that was for food purposes. Like I needed to know how much food to ship myself in advance. And so the way the Colorado Trail works is like you have different little towns that you can visit on the way, and you can ship yourself food packages before you go on the hike. And so I kind of knew approximately how many days it would take me to do certain parts of the trail, and that forces you to push yourself in certain areas where you might need to catch up on time and things like that. But I averaged 17 miles a day. It took me 35 days from start to finish. And I was pretty much like 1 or 2 days within my target of what I expected would happen. So I give myself a little bit of flexibility, but yeah, having that kind of somewhat rigid plan with the food idea, that kind of forced me to stay on target, if you will.
Yeah, food drives everything. That sounds about right. I mean, it sounds like you've mastered the art of being in the moment. I want to hang on that for a moment because really completing a task like that, or a feat, that's not even a task, that's a feat, is something to be marveled at. But then pairing it with that creative aspect, and then you look at our culture now where it's like, God forbid somebody goes to a concert and doesn't record the entire concert with their phone up. And I think this idea of immersing yourself while still being able to document and capture, because I still do think that's important. As photographers and creatives, we all know and can point to examples of times where we're like, I'm so glad I took a picture of that, or so glad I got a video of that. And I think there's this art of immersion where you can enjoy and be in the moment completely, but still photograph and document the moment. Was that kind of how you approached that feat?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most beautiful things about photography is that whether you're a street photographer or a landscape photographer or a wildlife photographer, the act of engaging in creative pursuits forces you to see the world in a completely different and novel way. And that couldn't be more true on my journey. It was so awesome to have the camera on that journey because it definitely forced me to slow down in certain aspects of the hike and savor like really special small moments. Like it sounds silly, but there were moments where I was hiking in the morning through a deep forest and the light was just filtering through the forest canopy and it was illuminating these small little purple aster flowers. And I had just a really fun time trying to make sense of that through the lens. But if I didn't have the camera, I'm not sure that I would have even noticed that. Little things like that, I think, is what makes photography such a beautiful pursuit. And the act of slowing down and being purposeful and reacting to what we're drawn to and what we're curious about, I think, is where the magic happens.
Yes, I love that idea of slowing down and being intentional. Now, Sean, you've mentioned that according to you, you're not the greatest landscape photographer. I don't agree with that.
Take my word for it.
I think a great eye is a great eye. But can you take that idea of slowing down into your work, into what you do in portraiture and in your street work? I actually love your rural work. And when I see, not the greatest landscape, I'm like, I look at your rural work and I'm like, that tells me, it's like the rural to me is like, it's the perfect balance between street and landscape. So I'm like, you got it in the bag. But can you talk about slowing your process down and being more intentional in your work and how that's been helpful for you?
Yeah, I think it's slightly different for the different genres. I think street, because the pace of the street can be quite frenetic, honestly. It's trying to make sense out of all the visual noise around you. And to do that, you need to start to distill out the things that you're looking for. I can't remember where the quote came from. You might know who said this, but there's a quote out there that says something like that the camera is a tool that can teach you how to see even when you don't have the camera with you. I relate to what Matt's saying so much. You could walk past this beautiful forest scene, or I could walk down a street scene, and you wouldn't be as tuned into it unless the camera had taught you how to notice the little things about that scene that sort of draw your eye, making the beautiful out of the ordinary, the overlooked, the things we walk past and we don't consider. The camera just teaches you how to double take and work out how to make something beautiful and worth sharing with the rest of the world out of something everyone else is walking past. So I just think it's a way of tuning into what's around you. I'll do little things on the street, for example, and a lot of street photographers would say you definitely shouldn't do this, so don't take my word for it. But for me, it works to like actually put headphones in sometimes, and I'll play like ambient soundtracks.
Interesting.
Because I find that if I've got too much noise and people yelling and jackhammers and whatever else is going on, and sirens, it's just more noise for me to cut through to find the visually interesting things. So if I take out one sense, I feel like sometimes it can heighten that visual sense and I can start to pare things down. And then it's starting to work out, what am I drawn to here? And for me, I'm always looking for those contrasty light and shadow scenes? And how can I play with shadows in a way that creates interesting graphical shapes? And that's learning how to see like a camera sees, not how we see as human beings, because the camera doesn't have our dynamic range of our own eyes. So we're seeing things in more contrast through a camera, and then we can play with that even more by dialing that contrast in and creating something even more interesting. Like portraits is totally different. Portraits, it's people. So it's interacting, it's having a conversation, and it's tuning into them and their pace. So, if I have someone in for a shoot, I'll be playing their music that they like because that puts them in a relaxed state. I'll be getting them into conversations about things that they find fascinating and interesting. And then it's almost coming back to, using some of those things I learned training in psychology and training as a counselor, like drawing people out in a way that makes them feel comfortable to be able to capture an honest moment with them. So it's a different kind of tuning in. There I'm hyper aware, visually, audio, everything. And really very, very specifically just plugging into that one human being and trying to dial out. I'm not fussing with the camera and fiddling with the lights constantly. It's this person, and then everything else is just a tool to capture that moment with them. And then the rural thing's been a nice switch, because this is why I say I'm not a landscape photographer, because if I'm shooting rural, like I'm running around, handheld with a little camera, there's no tripods and bags of filters and all the rest of cable releases. I just can't be bothered. But like, it's been a nice challenge now in a totally new context since moving up to Yorkshire. How do I photograph this in a way that's interesting? Even though I might not have, that very specific kind of landscape skill set, like forget the labels and the boxes. What can I do here with what I know how to do? What could I show the world that I see that's interesting here in the way that I shoot? Leave all the right way to do it out of the equation, because I don't really know that. I just want to find ways to show the world something I saw that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. And Matt, one thing that I love about your approach is this realness and not overdoing it. Again, we're in like a very saturated world of landscape photography. I mean that literally and figuratively, where some of these landscapes you look at, you go there and then you're like, wait, this isn't like the pictures. It doesn't even look like the same place. And you have this focus on presenting things as they are. So this would be a great piece of advice for our listeners out there. And allegedly for Sean, who says he's not the best landscape photographer, but for the people who want to capture landscapes and stay true to the landscape and really not overdo it, what is a piece of advice that you have for learning how to see these landscapes to capture that true essence of them?
Yeah, I love what Sean just said about not thinking about the way you're supposed to do it or following rules or tropes or the way that you're seeing what everyone else is doing online. I mean, one of my favorite Instagram accounts that exists, they no longer post anymore, but it's called Insta Repeat. And what they did is they created these mashups of these photographs that have been like replicated to death and different concepts that everyone is chasing and copying each other on. And that's like the complete opposite of what I want to do in my photography. And I think oftentimes people fall into this trap earlier in their photography career of looking at what other people are doing and trying to emulate that, because there's this perception that that's what you need to do in order to find success or to find your way in the world as a photographer. And I think oftentimes that leads people to editing in a certain style, or like you said, cranking the saturation up to 100 and things of that nature. And to be fully honest with you, I kind of have a unique perspective because I have made all of those mistakes in my photography career as well. And I've had the space and the wisdom to look back upon those things and realize why I did them and why maybe that wasn't the best approach for me to grow as a photographer. And so as it relates to realistic depictions of the world, that just for me comes down to my values. I'm a very, very staunch advocate for nature and for wild places. And I want the world to experience those places and to be transformed and taken to those experiences that are authentic, so that they too can feel like when they go into nature and they see and experience those things, that they can feel that raw power in the same way that I did as a photographer. And I think too often what we see happening online is we only see these perfected versions of landscapes where mountains are stretched and skies are replaced and things are curated and perfected and all of the distractions are removed with AI tools and things of that nature. And I think what that can do is it can kind of desensitize us to the natural beauty that we can find in the chaos of nature. and really what nature is truly about, which to me is all about that experience, all the good and the bad that comes with it in terms of 9 times out of 10, when you're going to go out for a landscape photography shoot, you're not going to get those amazing conditions that you see on Instagram. You're going to get boring skies or totally blue skies. And so then it becomes a matter of challenging yourself as a photographer and leveraging the conditions and the light that is available to you and making interesting photographs using your brain and your creative juices and coming up with something that's unique and original that's not based on what everyone else has already done or is already doing. So that's my thoughts on the natural presentation of nature.
Such a based take. And that's a great take for people who are out there and might have one shot at a location. Maybe you went on a vacation or a family trip or a work trip. And you decide to go check out a location and you don't have the iconic, epic weather or sun or light to go with it. So some great information there and a lot of great inspiration from you two in this first half. This is a great time to take a short break. So let's stand up, stretch, shake it out. If you're already standing, have a seat, relax. And when we come back, we'll continue our discussion with Matt Payne and Sean Tucker. We'll be diving deeper into learning from failure, more inspiration, and of course, everyone's favorite topic, gear.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. The best way to support the show is by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For links to gear and more information on today's guests, check out the show notes on your podcast app or visit our homepage on the B&H Explorer website and join our B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. And now, back to the show.
And we're back with Matt Payne and Sean Tucker. And before the break, we kind of scratched the surface on this idea of inspiration. And you might have one shot at a shot or a location to get that epic shot. So I want to throw it back to you, Matt, because I know you have some thoughts and you kind of want to crack that topic open a little bit more.
Yeah, it's funny because you had mentioned that oftentimes as photographers, we go to these locations and we get disappointed because the conditions aren't, light isn't what we thought it would be, and we kind of feel let down. And I think those are the moments where this magic can happen in terms of asking ourselves questions about why we make photographs. I think if we look deep down inside and ask, okay, why did I come to this spot and why do I want to make this photograph? Oftentimes that can reveal interesting things about our personal motivations and why we're feeling the way we feel in those particular moments. I have had so many of those moments in my photography career where I came to a location wanting to get a very specific photograph and I was let down and I was disappointed. And a lot of that has taught me to re-examine my mindset in terms of how I approach landscape photography and being much more open-minded to just being open to the experience and what I discover there, which has helped me temper those feelings of being let down. But it also has forced me to re-examine my why and my purpose as a photographer. I'm no longer seeking those images that might be commercially viable. I'm no longer trying to replicate what others have done before me that I know would probably get me more fame and success on Instagram and social media. Instead of what I'm doing is I'm looking more inward in terms of spending more time with the subjects and the moments that I'm drawn to and that I personally find interesting and fascinating, and putting those images out into the world and connecting with an audience that finds value and authenticity.
How do you get to that point? Is there like an aha moment for you or for the people who are out there and like, I want to find that purpose in my work. I don't want to be confined to putting out what I think other people want to see or chasing that trend or that photo that might get me virality. How did you get to that point where you really didn't care about that and you were more focused on finding, a shot that resonated with you and not the masses?
I think for me, it came down to recognizing that I was being motivated by external validation. And, there's a quote that says that comparison is the thief of all joy. And what I found that I was doing is I was comparing my photographs to other people that have been photographing natural landscapes for much more time than I have. They have a much larger body of work than I had. And when I was able to admit that there was more for me to learn and more ways for me to find my path, I think that kind of gave me the mental space and the freedom to make more mistakes in my photography, to be easier on myself when I maybe didn't get the photograph that I thought would be great. and to take more risks as a photographer, to take more photographs that might not be popular and see how those do. So I think that's a big part of it, is focusing inward and focusing on what motivates you as a human being.
So it wasn't just buying more expensive gear. That's what you're saying.
I did that. I definitely did that. I mean, I remember early in my career, I was obsessed with gear reviews and trying to figure out every last thing that I needed to get as a photographer. I probably bought every possible filter you could possibly own, and I had all of the best lenses. And at the end of the day, like, that's just not really what makes you a better photographer. Obviously, gear can make certain types of photography easier, and it can help you accomplish certain creative ideas that you have. Like, you can't just magically photograph a macro scene without a really good macro lens, or you can't photograph wildlife from 200 yards away with a 10 millimeter lens. So, obviously gear is important, but it's not going to make you a better photographer.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Sean, you talked about taking the rural photos and being very simple on the gear. What does that simple setup look like to you?
I've got a couple of Sony cameras that I use mostly. So it's like the A7 IIIs, and I've got an A7C, and just a couple of primes. My favorite prime is a Zeiss 55mm 1.8, which I love as like a kind of very small, compact, but really capable little prime that's got a little bit of character to it. And all the little Ricoh GR cameras I use sometimes. But the point for me is like, those cameras that I've got are infinitely better than the great photographers had access to, 40 years ago. So me saying to myself, yeah, but I need the really fancy one. I need the really expensive one, because that will make me a great photographer. It's like, if I put these cameras in their hands, they do incredible stuff with them. So the missing piece is not me trying to find money I don't have to buy gear I can't afford. It's improving the way that I see and improving my ability to capture what I see in front of me and to communicate that to someone who might view it. That's where the work needs to be done. And I mean, like Matt says, you need the right gear. That's true. But, any camera company these days, even some of their most basic cameras, are so capable now. It's not the missing piece. And I tell photographers all the time, the sooner you stop chasing the fancy gear, thinking that's the missing piece of the equation, the sooner you'll start to take some responsibility for the fact that it's always going to be your job to make an image that communicates something to an audience. It's always in your hands. Hopefully, if you give me a phone, I can produce something that looks decent, And I know that if I put my fanciest camera in the hands of a beginner, they're going to take bad images. The camera is not the missing piece. It's our ability to see and communicate with the camera. And that just takes a lot of time. I'm not a brilliant photographer, but I'm not a beginner anymore. I'm somewhere in the middle, and I'm on that journey, and I can feel myself getting a bit better every day. And for me, that's enough. That makes me happy.
Can we talk about the idea of progressing in your work? I love that humility, Sean, where it's like, you're not out here saying, oh, I've made it, I'm at the top of the mountain. You're constantly progressing and working at it. But there's this idea of consistency that you must maintain in order to get better. And I think in order for you to stay happy with your work, you can still stay hungry, but I think you want to be happy and satisfied in what you're producing. How do you maintain consistency while still progressing as an artist?
Consistency is an interesting one. I've made videos on this, and it's so strange the reaction you get. For some people, when you mention the word consistency, they think it's anti-creative somehow, and they get quite upset with you for saying that your work should be consistent. But I think there's two halves to the story. I think on the one hand, we don't progress unless we make a mess. You have to give yourself permission to play and to make a ton of bad images to work out what the good stuff is in there, right? That's just how it works. When I started in street photography, I just used my phone, and I gave myself permission to photograph anything that even sort of drew my attention and to try and make a good image out of it. And believe me, I produced a proper pile of rubbish. There was awful images in there, but I knew I had to do it. It's getting your first 10,000 photographs out of your system to try and find your way. So I think making a mess is a massive part of growing, and can even be a part of, maybe you're an established photographer of 10, 15, 20 years or something, but you feel your work stagnating. It's time to go back to playing, to find your way out of that hole. Even if the work you're making is good, Maybe you're a bit of a one-trick pony and you need to broaden it out a bit, go back to playing and making a mess and trying lots of different things that you're almost certain won't work, but you'll learn something. But then consistency comes in how you present your work to the world. Like, I don't want to present a body of work that's inconsistent within itself. I want to make a complete mess behind the scenes while I'm working it out. And then when I decide to show that work to the world, I want it to feel like each other. I want it to have a thread that's kind of my unique flavor that runs through it. I want it to have a perspective to it and a message to it. And in the details of it, yes, I want it to have similar contrast ratios perhaps, or similar ways that I treat color throughout, or whatever the technicality happens to be, maybe a similar focal length. Like, that's all good stuff for the presentation side of it, because I think that helps to tell a better story and so that the work holds together as a whole. But the making a mess stuff, I hear you, and people are absolutely right when they kick off. You need that to move forward. You need to give yourself permission to make a mess to move forward.
How did you find the nuance, or like you said, the little things that make your style? No matter what you're doing, there's always going to be these little things that you incorporate. Was that something that came later in your process, or was it something that you were doing and you had to actively search to say, well, what am I doing? What makes my work my work?
I mean, I'll use street photography as an example. When I started doing that, and by the way, this is back when I was doing product photography, and I found myself falling out of love with my camera because I was just photographing a production line of sofas for a day, 70 sofas in a day, each at exactly the same 6 angles. You're like, this is just a tool. There's no creativity in it. So I started to just go out with my phone, and I would get off the train and stop early so that I had a half-hour walk home instead of a 5-minute walk home in London. And I just challenged myself to photograph whatever I saw and find at least one image that I was kind of happy with a day to post it as a challenge to kind of work out what I was doing there. And when I took a step back and had just been photographing intuitively for months, themes started to emerge almost organically. I hadn't thought about doing that. I hadn't pre-planned, this is the kind of photograph I will take. That rarely happens for me. I have to start making the work, and then I find my way in the kind of mess of it. And the theme of hard light and shadow kept coming back, and single figures kind of walking through that hard light and shadow and having it be very graphical and often silhouetted. And it took a little bit of time to work out. You know, at the start, if you'd asked me back then, I would have said, yeah, it's just an aesthetic choice. I just think it looks cool. And of course, that's part of it. It happened in a very short space of time, maybe over a couple of months. A few people posted on my Instagram, oh, this thing you did here or there feels like something Edward Hopper did in his paintings. And it kept coming back, Edward Hopper. And I had no idea who he was. I was completely ignorant. So I looked him up and I saw, here's like an American realist painter, you know, working, especially in the 50s and 60s, a lot around New York. And that's kind of, you know, economic boom time, post-war. You know, people are coming in from the rural countryside and the city's bustling and jobs are going crazy and the economy's doing super well. But he often paints single figures that feel quite isolated, alone, in interesting light and shadow in these urban spaces. And I kind of reverse engineered it. I thought, why is he doing that? He's not trying to be a documentarian painting what the city looks like. He's trying to, I think, paint what we feel like in crowds of people, that even if we're surrounded by tons of people, we can still feel quite isolated and lonely. And then I backtracked it more to my own work and said, you know, I mean, I'm not the Edward Hopper of photography or anything, but there was some link they'd seen. I thought, what is it? And then I thought, why do I keep coming back to this single figure walking alone in interesting light and shadow? And then again, it was self-awareness. I went, well, you know, who am I? I'm an introvert. You know, crowds of people are not my happy place. In London, I would often try and find a quieter street to walk down on my own rather than walk down busy Oxford Street or something. And then I thought, maybe in a way I'm photographing myself, you know? When that kind of penny dropped for me, it was like, beyond the aesthetics, that's one side of it. You know, we all want our work to look cool so people like it. But if we track it back far enough and ask ourselves, what is it about my particular wiring and my personality and how I see the world that makes me shoot this way, that makes me even think this is interesting? Because then when you go back to it, you can kind of plug yourself into those images more, make that work more intentionally. Now I know what I'm doing. Now I know where it comes from. I think it's some kind of process like that, I reckon.
Interesting. Now, Matt, I want to bring you into this. We're talking about this idea of intention, right? But what happens when we hit that bump in the road, and that bump in the road turns into a slump. I want to talk about inspiration and how you guys get out of a slump, and how you guys take a creative rut and turn that, how do you inspire yourselves? We talk about inspiring others, but how do we pull ourselves out of the ditch, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that this process of growing as a person and as a photographer is not a linear one. It can very much happen in lots of different stages. And like in photography, for me, there are moments where I feel like I'm the best photographer on earth. And then like a week later, I'm like, wow, I have a lot to learn. I messed that photo up, or I could have captured that better image. I could have composed it better. And one of my favorite photographers, John Sexton, has a really famous quote. He says that I'm not a better photographer than you. I've just made more bad photographs. And I think that's a big part of this journey. And I think those moments where we're feeling those slumps and those bumps, I think those are potential aha moments and landslide moments where we can recognize that it's an opportunity for growth. And oftentimes what I find myself doing is looking for inspiration in other genres of art. One of my favorite genres to look for inspiration in is film. I love watching movies, not just for the plot and the story, but from a cinematography perspective. One of my most famous examples of that recently was a show on Netflix called Adolescence, and some of the cinematography in that was just fantastic. And I just love being inspired by genres outside of photography or outside of my genre in photography as well. I think it's important to get out of your bubble and out of your kind of niche and look for things that might be different and might change the way you see the world.
Any thoughts on that, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I talk a little bit about inspiration in the book I wrote and the YouTube channel I've got. But, if you take the word inspiration, I think we often talk about inspiration like it's a feeling. We'll say stuff like, I don't feel inspired today. And I think, I don't know if it's a feeling. I'm not sure that's how it works. I think we've got more agency in it than that. I don't know if you've heard this quote, inspiration will find you working. That you sometimes have to start doing it before you actually get that hit of inspiration. But beyond that, I think like if you pull it apart, inspiration, it comes from this Latin word inspiratio. And it's like this idea of being breathed into. So we've got this word respiration in English, which is our word for breathing. And then we've got inspiration, respiration. So this idea that if you make the space to be breathed into, you're going to have everything you need to put it out and actually make something with it. So the best example I have is like, we often, if you're like me, get our best ideas in the shower. And I think it's because it's the one time in our day where we don't have a screen in front of our face. We don't necessarily have sound going on. We're not focused on something. We'll often stand there. We'll feel the sensation of the water. We might close our eyes. And there's this different mode our brain kicks into. It sort of clicks in from conscious to subconscious. And I think that our subconscious mind is much more creative than our conscious mind. It's like if we're trying to solve a problem, right? We've got this phrase in English, racking our brain. I mean, racking, we're talking about a medieval torture device, this repetitive kind of stretching motion where if we've got a problem to solve, we're trying to work it out. But what we're doing is pushing those same thoughts through the same channels, trying to get a different result. And you'll often find that you get frustrated and you go, I can't solve this problem. And so you'll take yourself on a walk. And then 20 minutes into your walk, you won't really be thinking about the problem anymore, but suddenly the solution just presents itself. I don't know if you've had that experience. And I think it's because we've clicked into that subconscious space and our mind is working on it in the background in more creative ways than our conscious is just trying to push thoughts through the same channel. So creativity, if we're sitting there going like, I don't really know what I'm meant to be pointing my camera. I don't have ideas. It's funny when you interrogate people who are in that space, how often that I ask them, well, how much time have you just, left space for new ideas to come? Or are you constantly filling yourself with anxiety and running out with the camera and trying to do the same thing and it's not working again? Or have you actually made space for those new ideas to come? And I think making the space is things like journaling, right? Or going to therapy is helpful. I know that seems a silly thing to say if you're a photographer who's stuck with inspiration, but there's something missing. There's a piece missing somewhere. And then maybe it's in that self-awareness. Or taking a walk every day. Like I do that every single day because I work from home. I don't have a commute. I give myself one. I go for an hour-long walk in the morning. I don't go with a camera necessarily, but by the time I get home, if I've just walked and just given myself that mental space, I'll come back and the first thing I'll do is go to my notebook and write down 2 or 3 ideas I had on that walk. But if I sat at home staring at the computer going, I need this idea, I need an idea, I need an idea, I very rarely get it that way. So it's about making that space as often as you can in your daily life. Not just when you need an idea, by the way. It doesn't work like that. If you're like, I need an idea, I'll just go on a walk. Because you'll still be on the walk going, is it there yet? Is it there yet? I haven't got the idea. You're still in that anxious, conscious mental space. So how do you make that space a part of your life so that you're constantly filling that bucket of ideas back up and getting that inspiration being breathed into? That's how I think about it. You know, whether you're religious or whatever you think about it, like you're taking something from outside into yourself that kind of fills you up to say things with your art form is the way I like to think about it.
Wow. Sean, along the lines of what you've been talking about, there was a statement that you made in one of your videos that really struck me. And it began with the idea that if you don't teach yourself to enjoy the process of learning, then failure becomes unbearable. Can you expand on that thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think that failure is such an integral part of learning. You can't learn without failing. I think if you pick up a camera and you just make brilliant work from day one, I think you're just some kind of phenom who just arrived on the scene. I don't know if you learned anything, you know? For most of us, the way that it works is that we have to make a lot of mistakes and then work our way forward from those mistakes. That's how it works for 99% of us. And if you don't accept that making those mistakes is the only way we learn, then every time we fail, you're going to beat yourself up and feel like you're a failure and you shouldn't be doing this. This is how you get better. It's the only way to get better, as far as I know. It tracks back through everything. I do a lot of reading from sort of different spiritual traditions around the world. And something I pick up again and again is most spiritual teachers around the world will say that the only times we're learning in life as human beings is through great love or great pain. That's the only time. If our lives are kind of working out, we're not growing as much. And it's the same for creativity. You know, if we're like coasting and everything's going okay, we're probably not learning anything new. When things are bad or we're making a lot of mistakes, we're on the edge of something interesting, like we're pushing the boundaries for ourselves. So we have to reframe this idea that failure means we're a failure. It doesn't. Failure means we're growing. That's a good thing. And if you don't make that shift, you'll give up. Because you'll say to yourself, oh, but I've made so many mistakes and I've failed so much. You'll tell yourself that's an unbearable pain. It means something bad about me as a human being that I make so many mistakes, and you'll want to put the camera away. And that would be a tragedy. Failure is the only way forward.
Sean, I want to go back to something you said, and it's funny because in listening to you guys on the podcast 2 years ago, the topic came up of AI. And it's so funny whenever the AI topic comes up, everybody laughs, and it's like this audible, like, all right, here it comes, AI. And you just said something about, you know, these thoughts that come to us in the shower, and it's because we're not in front of a screen. I think the real conversation is not AI. The real conversation is, are we going to see a pre-social media, pre-screen time era ever come back? Are we going to hit a point where we get back to being off the screen and living life and going out and actually talking to people? You know, Sean, you're out there in the street talking to people, and I'm sure you can talk for days and weeks and months about all the beautiful experiences you've had just sharing a conversation and different perspectives with people on the street, the same way that Matt can share about going out and just losing yourself in nature where you have 360 degrees of green earth surrounding you. Do you guys think we're going to get back to that point? Are we going to get just pushed to the brink where we start going backwards in time and we start going in reverse technologically?
Go on, Matt.
I can take that one first, I guess, to fall on the sword for you, Sean. I've seen a lot of chatter from people online about the desire to return to those days, and especially driven by AI and all of the constant 24-hour news cycle and just how we're bombarded by everything on a constant basis. And I think it was such a gift that I gave myself to do this through hike. And I really encourage other people to do something similar in their lives. It doesn't have to be a 35-day journey. It can literally just be like, give yourself an hour on a Sunday afternoon to walk your local park. I think the missing ingredient for most people right now is that intention. And oftentimes I think the intention is lacking because they haven't necessarily experienced what positives they can get out of that type of moment where you give yourself that freedom to just be alone with yourself and your thoughts without any purpose and just experience things from a neutral perspective in nature or, like Sean says, in your shower. I think it has to come from a place of intention.
I agree. I mean, these words, intention and inspiration, keep coming up. What is it about intention that, I mean, obviously it sounds great. And for those of us who believe in shooting with intention and really creating with purpose, we know what it means. But for somebody who doesn't grasp this idea, how do we get them there? How do we get them over the hump to having more purpose, having more intention, especially given what we were just talking about? We're speaking another language to somebody who's in their screen and who's just doom scrolling and swiping and focused on clicks and likes and comments and all this stuff. How do we get them over the hump? Because I think that's a huge part of the answer of how do we go back to that existence that was more based on living our lives. Is there an answer? Is there an easy answer? Is it a whole complicated conversation to have?
Do you want to take that one, Sean?
Yeah.
There's no more swords to fall on.
I mean, I'm not trying to, rescue anybody from social media. I think we very quickly vilify it. And part of that's true, obviously,
Mm.
But I mean, for some people, it does good stuff. It's not all bad. And as artists, let's be frank, like if we told artists in history, hey, by the way, there's going to be this ability for you to make something and then potentially share that work with someone on the other side of the planet in seconds, most of them would have let you take an arm off for that ability. Like that would be huge, right? So on that side of it, it's a gift. But yeah, I mean, where it's difficult is that most social media gamifies itself. That's where it's poisonous. And it adds numbers to the things we do. And then we believe the fallacy that that number means we're more talented than someone with a lower number, or less talented than someone with a higher number. And that's just not true at all, because popularity does not equal mastery. It's not the same thing. So that perspective is important. But then I think people are naturally finding, you hear it a lot nowadays, people are getting frustrated with social media. And especially after COVID a few years ago, where people were stuck at home and doom scrolling for hours, psychologists were even starting to talk about something called digital fatigue. Is we were stuck inside with these screens, and the minute we could get outside, more people started to go on walks and hikes and getting out. People left cities just so they could get out of their flat and go and buy a house in the countryside with a garden, because they realized getting out, getting that space equaled more headspace, and that was important. So I think that shift is starting to happen. And, who can predict these things? But I mean, I can already see that less and less people are as engaged with social media as they used to be. If you look at the numbers on things like Facebook, for example, it's tanked over the last 10 years compared to what it used to be. Instagram is dying a death. We can all feel that. YouTube numbers are down. I think there's a balancing coming about. And I don't want to see these things go away, because I think they do get used for good things and they are helpful and useful to some people. But we are waking up and we're going, okay, we've been given this gift that can also be a poison chalice. And we each need to decide for ourselves how we want to use it. Beyond the addictive qualities, we need to take some responsibility and say, how much do I want this in my life so that it's useful? And where do I need to draw a line? Like for myself, for example, I don't allow myself to watch videos in the morning of any sort. So I'm not going to allow myself to sit on Instagram and watch videos, or sit on YouTube in the morning and watch videos, because I want space. I want the first thing I do when I get back from that walk, I'll have a shower and I'll sit down and I'll read for half an hour, and then I'll do all the admin email stuff. I don't want videos in my life before lunchtime. That's just a little tiny boundary I've drawn for myself, just saying, that's enough of that. And then I'm allowing myself for the rest. And everyone needs to find their own line with that. And I think they will.
That's such great perspective there, Sean. I'm sitting here as you're talking, I'm like, oh my God, yeah, I'm always so negative when I talk about social media. The good there is. And I think it's that perspective and setting boundaries. And I think that's what makes you, you. It goes beyond your work. It's who you are as a person. And this perspective that you introduce into the conversation. Now, that being said, yes, I think a good place to close out this conversation is on the good. And the good is that people can now go onto their phone at any age and find their passion, find their success. They don't necessarily need what they needed 20 years ago to become successful or to find something that they really enjoy. I can show my work across the world. We're in 3 different time zones right now, having a conversation that's going to inspire hopefully millions of people one day. And we can do that because of technology, because of social media. Now, that all being said, how do we remain relevant? How do we take something that is so vast and so saturated and competitive and use it to our advantage? If you guys could give one solid piece of advice for somebody who wants to take their work and get it out to the people, to the masses, or really use social media or technology in a great way to promote themselves and to progress as an artist, how do they do it?
I can tackle that one from my perspective. I think the first thing it starts with is self-awareness and understanding who you are as a person and leveraging everything that makes you unique and your perspective and the way you see the world and the way you use the camera and showing the world your unique vision, whether that's photographs of cars in the street or nature or the aurora or rural scenes in the UK, whatever your jam is, and just lean heavily into what makes you you as a photographer. Because I promise that you're going to find an audience that appreciates that uniqueness that you bring to the world. And I think it also requires us to redefine what we think success looks like. And I think for everyone, it's going to be different. Sean, I love the way he prefaced how it's finding what I love in the world and how I can bring value and meaning and purpose to others through that work. And I think that redefinition of personal success, shifting it away from perhaps monetary or commercial purposes and more along the lines of how we can inspire others or how can we bring value to others in different ways. I think that's where you're going to find separation in this saturated marketplace.
I agree with everything Matt said. And I think the other side of it is also make the work you want to see more of in the world and then stick to your guns, because I know what sort of videos I could make, for example, that would get more views. If I did more gear reviews, if I did more sort of easily accessible kind of quick tips videos, for example, they would get more views because there's more beginners on YouTube who need those kind of tips and that kind of advice. So just statistically, it would do better. But I also know that there's nothing wrong with videos like that, but that's not what I'm meant to be doing. I know I'm not wired like that. So I'm going to be making videos for a smaller audience, but it will make me happier because it's genuinely what I feel like I have to give. And it seems to be that it makes the right audience that finds that stuff, it really means a lot to them as well. So you have to, as early as possible, put aside that kind of chase for fame and fortune. I want to make lots of money on it. I want as many eyeballs on it as possible, because then the temptation is just to make a weak version of the popular, right? To look out there and say, what's quote unquote working for other people, and then I'll just do a version of that. But if you do that, you're killing your best opportunity to find your own voice, which ironically I think is a stronger way to build an audience around something more unique that could only come out of you. And it might not be as big an audience, but it will be a far more fulfilling and meaningful experience if you can find the courage to go that way.
Wow. That conversation was as refreshing as it was enlightening. I want to thank you guys for that. Sean, we'll start with you. Any current or upcoming projects that you have, and where can we learn more about your work?
My website is just seantucker.photography, or you can find me Sean Tucker, SeanTucker, on YouTube. I do have, I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to talk about it. I'm trying to think now. I have a book coming out next year that I'm writing with a friend of mine, Joshua K. Jackson, on street photography. So that will be out probably middle of the year next year, which we're both quite excited about. So you can keep an eye out for that.
Awesome. And Matt, what about you? What do you have cooking, and where can we learn more about your work?
Yeah, my website's probably the best place, mattpaynephotography.com. That's MattPayne. And man, I've always got so many things in the fire, but you guys did such a wonderful job of talking about my project that I'm trying to get out into the world right now. My Kickstarter campaign that's in process right now for my book that I wrote, which was inspired by my journey in the Colorado Trail and hiking the highest 100 mountains in Colorado. 25 essays on psychology and philosophy relating to that journey. And hopefully it's something that people will find value in. It's also going to have tons of photographs relating to that journey. And I'm excited to get that out into the world.
I love it. And we'll definitely have some links to guide our listeners in the right direction. I want to thank you guys both today. This was really just an awesome, and like I said, it was refreshing to hear these different perspectives. So I want to thank you guys again for coming on today.
Thank you. Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us today. If you are a fan of the show but are not yet a subscriber, please head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, B&H's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog, where we post photos from our guests along with our show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast group, where you can share your favorite photos and comment about the show. I'm your host, Derek Fosbender. Jill Waterman is our creative producer. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein, and our executive producer is Richard Stevens. On behalf of us all, thank you so much for tuning in today.